Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Folks, we've been writing this big degrowth book, and it's done, and it's in the editor's hands. Isn't that great? You don't have to listen to us talk about writing it anymore. Though you do have to listen to us. I mean, you don't have to listen to us say anything. This is a podcast, and you can turn it off whenever you want, which is maybe... I don't want to break the spell in case you thought you were sort of trapped here. Anyways, this week we're going to talk about not our book, someone else's book that just came out. It's a book called Slow Down or Die, The Economics of Degrowth by Timothée Parrique. I'm positive that's not how you actually say his name because he's French. And there's a few accent marks on his names, and I just know that I'm not doing it right. But it is a cool book, and I'm pretty excited to talk about some of the big ideas in it. Dean, do you want to say anything about it?
Well, it's a good book, and like you said, Matt, now that we're done writing our own book, it's great to read other people's books, but also extremely unsettling to read other people's books and be like, whoa, that was really cool the way that person said that. We should have said that. Or to be like, oh man, I wish we could cite that cool thing in our book, but we can't. A great problem to have that we're not allowed to tinker with it anymore. Finally free, but also paradoxically unfree to do anything more on it. But it is nice to kind of see the degrowth conversation going on, and this is a cool contribution. Timothée Parrique has been kind of like a degrowth voice, doing a lot of interesting work for quite a while, but this is the first time he's had a book in English. It's translated from French. He was a graduate student, an economist who worked on degrowth, and then has written a bunch of either published or kind of like unpublished but circulated papers on degrowth and economics, and just an interesting character in the big degrowth conversation. So it's nice to finally have like a sustained piece of writing from him to engage with. I think it's a cool book.
Yeah, definitely. It is a cool book, and you're right. It is great that he has a book in English. You might remember maybe like 3 years ago we actually did talk about him again on an episode where we read something he wrote about decoupling and the problems that come along with decoupling. So if you're long-time listeners will be rewarded with the internal sort of Magnificast cinematic universe that we've been building over the long term. Anyways, this is a very cool book. We're gonna get into it in a minute. Hey, here's one thing though that I think is cool. Timothée Parrique, he is an extremely smart, sort of economist-minded person, and I think I don't know, you and I, Dean, we like to know about economics, and I think that we're pretty good about writing about those things. Timothée Parrique is kind of like extremely an economic-minded person and has, I think, maybe more scope on economics than we do, which is fine. And that definitely shines through in this book. There's lots of great sort of economic insight. The one thing, though, that I think that we do really well in our book is kind of tying degrowth to social movements and kind of thinking through that side of things a bit more, which is something that I think is rarely done in degrowth books. So that's cool. Good for us. I'm not just tuning my own horn here, though I am. I'll give it a little toot. I say that because there's this chapter that I'm really interested in Timothée Parrique's book that is about social reproduction. And he kind of sets this chapter up. And the case that he's making is that social reproduction is really important. The idea being that before you can have a measurable GDP, you need all kinds of things like someone to cook and clean and make food, and you have to have time for rest and so on. All these things kind of go into the GDP, but they're not counted by the GDP. So all that's happening. There's this really interesting argument that he has about social reproduction and about how sort of the more commodified life becomes, the less space we have for that social reproduction, and the ways that sort of social links and connections break down. And I think that is all very interesting and all very true. But it does raise a lot of questions about the sort of space for religious communities and those types of deeper spiritual connections that people share with one another. So I want to talk about this chapter of his book in particular about social reproduction, but I think that maybe we can add this Christian element into the mix and see where we get at the end.
Yeah, I mean, something I really like about reading economists who talk about degrowth, because you can talk about degrowth from a variety of positions, right? So maybe just to back up, you have people like John Bellamy Foster. He knows a lot about the economy. He knows a lot about economics, but he comes from a sociological background, and that's cool, and that comes through. You could talk about it in a kind of with like a political science background. You could talk about it from a climate change background, all these kinds of things. Something I like about reading people who come from economics backgrounds is that there is this attention to, I guess, how economists imagine the world under capitalism, and then how those kinds of imaginary constructs that have real material consequences end up leaving out a lot of other stuff that's going on in the material world. And I think the more you're familiar with how economists talk about stuff in general, the more you're also able to, the way I guess that Marx did, kind of identify how the kind of theories create their own gaps or create their own contradictions. Or the minute you introduce something kind of external to an economic model, the model starts to look a bit silly because you're like, well, I guess I didn't think about something like people have to eat food, just like very funny, normal stuff that only economists can kind of ignore. And I think that is something I really value in this book too. But the more I read economics, the more I also wish that there were more like fun studies of like churches and economics, which I am definitely not going to become that kind of person, but I'd like to know the person who is. Just thinking about things like, for example, how churches contribute to social reproduction, like you were just saying, or how churches kind of function for better and for worse as like stopgaps in an economy. Like they catch people who are falling through it with lots of contradictions involved, or the very nuts and bolts of like church economies. Like they buy a bunch of stuff. They buy little communion cups. They buy bread. They buy wine. All these kinds of things. They make repairs on their buildings. That stuff. They pay people wages. Some of them have complicated relationships to labor unions. All these kinds of things. Where I wish. Here's what I'm saying. I wish I was an economist, because I think that there are a lot of very funny things you can say about Christianity if you sort of had like ready to hand a big library, a big archive of like economist ideas. So anyway, reading Timothée Parrique's book on degrowth really brought all that back to me and made me think more about like, I wonder what the kind of political economy of Christianity is kind of doing in a growth economy, and how it might be also like materially reorganized to maybe be a little more, to be building the degrowth economy in the shell of the growth economy.
Man, if you had a time machine, you can go back and you could tell yourself all of that, and your younger self would not listen at all, I'm sure. There's no way.
And he'd be right. I wouldn't like it. But I wish that someone else would do it.
That's a great point. Okay. Well, you could go back in time and convince somebody else's younger self to do it, and then, we'd be reaping the benefits right now.
The weirdest episode of The Terminator, just stepping out of a big pod naked, being like, listen, you've got to study the political economy of Christianity. You got to go.
No, your life's not in danger. You don't need to go to this helicopter. I just want you to read a few books and then do some big economic work later in your life.
Come with me if you want to use a calculator.
Oh man, that'd be great. Okay, John Connor. I've got to go after this. Cool. Anyways, there's so much else going on in this book. This is just like one chapter that we're talking about. So if you're not interested in this conversation, which I find that hard to believe, there's a lot of other stuff in this book that you might want to pick up and take a look at. One of the things that is interesting in this book, this is something we've talked about in the past, that is actually it was a contribution that Timothée Parrique made, and it is in our book. So that's something too. But he has a really cool definition of degrowth that Dean and I think both like. And I think that we like it because it is a very useful definition. So degrowth, man, people get so bent out of shape about it. They, love to be wrong on the internet about what degrowth means. But Timothée Parrique has kind of come up with this sort of like instrumentalization, this instrumental sort of modular type of definition. So he says that degrowth is a downscaling of production and consumption to reduce ecological footprints, planned democratically in a way that is equitable while securing well-being. And the cool thing about this definition is that if you wanted to, you could just shuffle it around and it wouldn't really be that big of a deal. If you wanted to emphasize, for example, the ecological part, that could come first. Or if you wanted to emphasize the well-being or democratic parts, those could be first or swapped around or whatever. It's a definition that he has written so that you can use it to grow the big tent of degrowth. And I really appreciate that type of innovative thinking around writing and defining something. Very cool. So anyways, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about degrowth: downscaling production and consumption to reduce our ecological footprint, and done so in a democratic way that is equitable and all about well-being. Pretty cool.
Pretty cool. Yeah, good to have a modular definition. Also, that definition it features in his book, but he also has this working paper where he explains where it comes from, and he had reviewed 115 definitions of degrowth and then kind of boiled them all down into like 4 kind of motivations that sort of find their way into that modular definition. And I think that is also an extremely funny kind of economist way of thinking, but in a good way, helpful way. And I think that especially when people ask you what degrowth is, it's so tempting to be like, I don't know, it's kind of a vibe, or like it's a discussion, a conversation. All that's true. But what I like about what Parrique is doing is to say, well, there's a practical side to it, right? You're downscaling production and consumption. That's the really easy part to get. You could say more than that, but that is a big piece of it. And also, you're doing it with some particular values in mind. You care about the climate, you care about democracy, you care about equitability, you care about well-being, these kinds of things. That's like the motivation. And I like that it's a definition that's kind of like aggregating just a huge discussion of what degrowth is into like a pretty, plug and play definition, so that, someone at a weird barbecue or whatever asks you about degrowth, you can just tell them what it is in 2 minutes and not have to, like, I don't know, cite a bunch of books before they get their hot dog or whatever.
Great. So within this great book that has this great definition of degrowth, we're going to be looking at the 3rd chapter. The 3rd chapter is titled Market versus Society, the Social Limits to Growth. And like we said a minute ago, this is all about social reproduction and, all the things that kind of go with it. You'll understand the thesis shortly. I guess I'll just read this first little bit, and then we can start talking through some of it. So Parrique writes, the basic premise of this chapter is the following. Those who produce are themselves produced. For example, for a baker to be able to make bread, they need a recipe, ingredients, an oven, and energy, the factors of production. But also self-confidence, a rested and healthy body, a balanced mood, a healthy environment, the factors of reproduction. A depressed baker would be as incapable of producing a baguette as a baker with no oven or flour. In other words, all economic activity relies on extra economic activity. So the picture of the economy, especially when it comes to production and reproduction, as Parrique is kind of painting it here, is kind of like an iceberg floating in the water. You have all of the big production parts of society, the baguette, if you will, that is things that are measurable by the GDP, things that are produced, things that are bought and sold, and so on. But then you have a sub water part of the iceberg, all the things that lie just below the surface that you can't see, that are not measured with the GDP, the things that contribute to someone's self-confidence or their rested and healthy body, right? All of these things that are crucial and important, and things that you can't do an economy without, but they are not tracked by the GDP. So anyways, an important observation, because if you were just to be if you were, I don't know, a complete doofus and you use the GDP to, I don't know, judge the health of society, you'd be missing out on all of those really important factors. None of those things play into how the GDP is calculated.
Which, for what it's worth, most people are doofuses. The world is run by doofuses who do exactly that. They use the GDP to judge the health of society, as we talked about not very long ago on a whole episode about the GDP. So you can go listen to that, I guess, if you want the background on that.
That's right. And if you are a doofus and you're listening to this and you think that that's a good way to judge the health of society, you could be like, well, true, the GDP does not cover those things, but it does cover, like, consumer spending. And you could, and they might argue, well, if people are buying things, if individuals are consuming, that must mean something about their self-confidence, that they have a rested and healthy body. But I'm here to tell you, I buy things all the time and I don't have a rested or healthy body. So that disproves that.
Yeah, that's right. Just look in a mirror. Well, okay. We're not talking about the GDP on this episode. However, every degrowth book has to have a chapter about the GDP. That's just part of it. That's a law. And this one does too. And when I first opened it up and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to read another chapter about the GDP, I
I
was
can't do
pretty
it.
ready to skip it.
Yeah.
But I didn't. I read it and it is very good. It kind of fills in a lot of interesting economic stuff behind the GDP. And I mean, it repeats a lot of the typical degrowth critiques of GDP, rightly so, but it does also kind of like help you understand a little more like why the GDP is widely used and what it is and isn't trying to measure. And one argument that Parrique makes is that like the GDP does give you some information. He refers to it as like a blood pressure monitor for the economy. But it doesn't give you all the information about an economy, and that's the big problem with it. So I like it because he's not just like, I mean, we're being silly because we have a podcast and you're allowed to be silly, and you can say you're just a doofus if you think the GDP is any good. Parrique is also kind of silly, but published a real book, and in it he goes out of his way to try to like explain why that is. But I'm here to tell you that even after you read that at the end, if someone told you the GDP is like a prime way to understand the health of a society, you could still rest assured that it is in fact a doofus way of thinking. So it doesn't undermine the thesis, but it does maybe give you a little more insight into what's going on there.
Yeah, big time certified doofus meter. It's over the top if you think the GDP is a great way to sort of understand the economy by itself, I guess. Cool. Well, anyways, kind of trying to push this point further, Parrique goes out of his way to start like explaining like the the breakdown of an average French person's day, sort of time budget wise. The time budget is an idea that plays in this chapter quite a bit. Time budget, innovation, saving time, and so on. These are all big ideas because people who listen to this podcast know, I mean, this is what Marxist economists talk about all the time. Not that Parrique is necessarily a Marxist, but economists who are interested in labor and production, they're always wanting to know exactly how someone's life breaks down, or the socially necessary labor time, or something like that. And Parrique is no different in the long line of economists kind of thinking about these things. He writes this: the average day of a French person is composed of 2 hours and 32 minutes of professional activities, and 40 minutes of study, 3 hours and 31 minutes of domestic activities, 12 hours and 14 minutes of personal care and rest, and 5 hours and 3 minutes of leisure. This is such a funny breakdown, and I would like to think that I am on a daily basis, I'm working more than 2 hours and 32 minutes. In case my boss is listening to this, and I know they're not. I do for sure. I do for sure work more than that. But a very interesting breakdown of all of those things. But it's great. It's great. Whatever. It'll change by country and sort of specificity, whatever. That's the French breakdown, and that's okay. But what is interesting about that is that it does show you, the time that's actually captured by the the GDP or whatever is actually strikingly small, right? 2 hours and 32 minutes of professional activities. So that's your GDP time. And then the rest of it is all the things that you need to be able to do to make sure the GDP time can happen, the 2 hours and 32 minutes of professional activities. So anyways, a very interesting way of sort of breaking things down. And it is sort of revealing of just how big of a chunk of your day is geared towards not production, all the things that you might need to do to get that production done in the first place. This would be, very different, I think, if you worked a sort of different type of job or whatever. You're not a professional managerial class person. You work in a factory. This is different. But what is not different is that people only have 24 hours a day, and we all have to kind of use that 24 hours to do the productive part, the professional activities. And we have to do all of the domestic activities and the personal care and rest activities. 24 hours is as much as we're getting. And I think this kind of breakdown, whether it fits or not, helps you kind of figure out exactly what that breakdown looks like, and the ways that parts of your day actually support the other parts of your day.
Yeah, I like something in this book that kind of repeats. I like this point where Parrique talks about how Many people in degrowth will talk about the natural limit of the climate when we talk about the economy, which is what we do too. And that is maybe a very simple point to get, right? You can't have infinite economic growth on a finite planet. The planet only has so much to give. Capitalism is never satisfied. That's a fundamental contradiction. So we can't respect that limit, and that's quite bad. And we should respect that limit. And that requires also affirming that there is a limit, that there are lots of natural, biological limits, ecosystem limits, all these kinds of things. What is really fun is Parrique also talks about how there are like other natural limits, like 24 hours being in a day, or just like human limits and the kinds of limitations that are just imposed by virtue of like geographic limitations. Like France is a country that's only so big; it has access to these resources. If it wants to um, transcend that limit, it has to go somewhere else and get that stuff. All those kinds of things. And the way that things get moved around to account for like what he calls a time budget or other kinds of budgets is really interesting, because if you want to maximize your time, you're going to have to like steal from other people or borrow from other people, or something that might save you a lot of time actually relies on making other people spend a lot more time doing stuff, or kind of the accumulated time that people have given to inventing stuff, repairing stuff, all that kind of thing. And I think that is a really cool contribution to sort of say that degrowth is a conversation about limits. Some of those limits are ecological, some of them are also physical or chronological, or maybe have to do with our, like, I don't know, human life. And I taught a class on degrowth that just wrapped up. And that was actually a point that resonated a lot with people who were in the class, and me too, that capitalism, existentially, we tend to experience it as something that's constantly like sucking away all the time that we want, like our free time, valuable time. You're sort of pressured to turn everything into a side hustle or maximize and monetize your time. And it kind of runs you dry, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really respect your own limits. And the amount of work you have to do as a person to figure out what your own limits are and how to protect them and kind of create those boundaries and speak up for yourself and all that kind of stuff is also like a burden on you as a person, which sucks. And I think that's actually a very helpful contribution that Parrique makes, right? That there are these time budgets too, existential kind of limits that we don't account for when we think about how capitalism is constantly trying to squeeze as much as it can to grow its profit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. This is another line from Parrique that I thought was cool, and kind of getting at the same idea here. He writes, "Capitalism never sleeps, and that's one of its greatest contradictions. More and more businesses organize themselves into rotating shifts with atypical hours to ensure constant production. We can optimize production up to a certain limit, but one thing is certain: no matter our mode of social organization, we will never work more than 24 hours. Every economy therefore functions within a limited time budget. An hour spent devising online advertisements is an hour that will not be spent growing vegetables, and an hour spent in the fields is an hour less for helping a neighbor carry up her groceries or writing articles on Wikipedia. If the finitude of natural resources implies that no material production can grow indefinitely, that of available time implies that no production at all can grow indefinitely. So we could say that economics consists in collectively organizing and sharing our finitudes." So I think this is actually pretty deep if you start thinking about it. There's a section in this chapter that I didn't really include any notes about in this episode, but it's about the argument about like innovation within capitalism. So you might say like, okay, all of this stuff is true. All of this stuff takes time and so on. But production inevitably becomes more streamlined the more sort of technological apparatuses are applied to it or whatever. And he has a lot of things to say about that are quite interesting. But to me, the most interesting thing is that innovation within production, we treat it as sort of like a magical moment where there's some time, the steam engine's invented and that's a revelation that changes the entire world. And it's like basically a magical moment where someone finds like the spell to make capitalism go a little bit faster. But Parrique thinks that if you kind of look at things through this particular lens, what you recognize is that innovation isn't like a magical thing that happens, but it is a factor of production itself, meaning that innovation doesn't happen, but it like takes all of these other reproductive moments to even support it. So, he uses the example that he uses in the book is like, Facebook wouldn't exist if Mark Zuckerberg didn't have somebody like making him sandwiches or something, like providing food for him. And okay, I guess that's true. That's that's an example I don't like. If Mark
That's
Zuckerberg,
Sweet
if
Baby
nobody
Ray's.
should, yeah, exactly. The Sweet Baby Rays. Nobody should be making Mark Zuckerberg food at all. We cannot have this guy making more bad things. But but you get the idea, right? That like even the things like that innovate society that are supposed to make production go faster, they rely on this sort of like ever extending like long tail of like reproductive things that kind of prop it all up, right? So it can't be sort of like undergirded, or you can't sort of explain it all away with magic or something, or just big technological sweeps. It doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah, Parrique pulls that from feminist economics in particular, and we talked about
Right.
that again on some previous stuff. I think maybe in the GDP episode too. There's lots of cool stuff around that. People like Silvia Federici or others who have done just a ton of work to try to explain that the economy relies on all this labor that is literally devalued or not counted as value at all, whether it's housework or I don't know, rest work or whatever, the kinds of things you have to do to reproduce a social life that allows people to participate in the capitalist economy. Lots of interesting stuff there. I always think about there's a kind of wild philosopher, Luce Irigaray, who's a complicated
Right.
person, wouldn't
Yeah.
endorse everything she says, but she has this sort of interesting observation about gender and capitalism, where she argues that because capitalism emerges from a patriarchal kind of society, it inevitably kind of like erases or controls, but really disappears any ability for women to kind of create, like, discover what it is to be a woman, because all of a woman's identity is like wrapped up in reproducing the male ideal of capital accumulation. And she has this really cool kind of gendered critique of capitalism. She did a lot of work also with the Communist Party of Italy, trying to sort all that stuff out. So a person who was actually involved in politics in a cool way. And anyway, she has this sort of like interesting imaginative exercise where she's like, what if women were able to kind of just like get some space and think about how they would make the world differently without the pressure of participating in or contributing to the like reproduction of patriarchal capitalism. And there's like a great moment where she's like, so maybe that is something like communism, but we actually don't have any idea what it is because we don't have the chance to figure it out. And it's important to like leave that future open to determine like what would a more caring or more domestically oriented or socially reproduced society kind of look like if we kind of valued that sort of stuff. Anyway, lots more to say about it. She's a very interesting theorist, but I guess what it all makes me think about is there's this attention in degrowth and in feminist economics and others to what is like not only swept under the rug that makes the economy go, but what is actually like essential to making the economy go that we treat as
Hmm.
inessential or unimportant. And there's something really fascinating too about kind of like creating space to imagine, well, what if we valued that stuff in a really big way and sort of made it like more obviously central to how we organize society. And if we did that, we might also discover that our time would have to be oriented differently. Like maybe you'd have to, men in particular would have to spend more time doing things like childcare or I don't know, the dishes or the kind of traditionally coded women's work or racially coded work and so on. So lots of interesting things too to think about with respect to like time justice and what does it look like to reorient the way that we spend our time in our time budgets to make a more kind of equitable distribution of time. Just a lot of cool conversations around that, I think.
Yeah, that's all really important stuff. And Preek does have some of that in the text as well. But I think we're going out of our way here to specifically say some of it because I think it's a point worth making. Um, Man, this is a little bit unrelated, but you mentioned a minute ago just how we'd have to sort of figure out how we want to budget time or reorient our society, sort of in this degrowth sort of framework. And there's a section later in the book um, that's about a post-growth society. And like, what is it? What does the world look like after we've already won and degrowth is kind of like there? And it's cool. I think that it's a great chapter because it's something that people don't often think about. Like, what is it after we do all of the degrowing? Like, do we grow a little bit more sometimes or a little bit less sometimes? All interesting stuff. But Parikh does have this really interesting part where he's like, well, we have to think of like sort of new gauges for what economic success looks like, and one of them might just be like, how much rest can we get? Like, is there a gross domestic nap time or something where it's just like the more rest that people are getting, the better the economy is doing, or the better we can measure well-being or something. And I don't know. I mean, it's silly, it's funny, but it's also kind of awesome to be like, well, what if our society really was organized in such a way that like success meant everyone was just very chill and got to take a big nap? I think that's awesome. So,
Yeah,
anyways, sort of on the horizon of utopia or whatever, but it's a fun one to think about.
that's right. The new GDP, gross domestic prayer time. That's the one that we need.
Oh boy.
Um, I mean, there's so much more to say about time in general. Lots of things that I want to say about it, but I'll restrict myself to maybe reading a really cool passage in the book that I think pulls this out a little bit further. Because the other piece is, not only are we not able to value things like rest time, but again, the distribution of time means that some people's time is expropriated and other people are allowed to, I don't know, use that time in a freer kind of way. So he says, if we put all our outputs to a time footprint test, chances are that many of the innovations we consider time saving would turn out to be terribly time consuming on a macroeconomic scale. Here's the key takeaway: increasing our speed does not always save us time. A huge Virilio kind of point, by the way.
Yeah, I know. Wrap your horns
When I
around that one for
explain
sure.
that I don't fly, and that therefore it takes me about 30 hours by train to go from France to Sweden, I'm often told I'm lucky to have enough free time to take such a journey. Yet it's quite likely that the effective speed by plane is lower than that by train, at least for short distances. Those who fly from Paris to Bordeaux save very little time by wasting a lot of other people's time. To put it another way, some people, often the wealthiest, accelerate momentarily, but only by slowing down the economy as a whole. This is not technical progress, it's a shifting of production costs. As this one guy argues, individuals privatize benefits while socializing parts of the cost. The moral of the story is that no infinite growth is possible on a finite world. Past certain thresholds, the speed of some is achieved at the cost of slowing others down. And I think that is such an interesting point to think more
Yeah.
about, like who gets to move and why. And it got me thinking a lot about AI in particular. I feel like people talk a lot about generative AI, especially as like a time saver. It saves you time. But the irony is that, like, on the whole, it actually sucks up a ton of people's time. People have to do lots of work to make a data center work. For example, if your water is like if you live near a big water or a big data center and your water output is low, your flows are low or toxic, or your costs of water are going up because of that, then you have to spend a lot of extra time doing things like working more to pay for your water, or I don't know, sitting on the phone with your city councilor being like, I'm mad about this, right? It like steals the time of whole communities. It steals the time of people who have to mine all these like critical minerals to make all that technology work. And also that somebody can like generate a bad minions meme of a minion with like too many extra fingers saying, I don't know, hope you have a good day. It's just like a wild thing that AI feels to me like such a good example of that point, right? Many other things too, but AI is sold as like a technology that will save us so much time, that will accelerate all our progress. But again, the question is like, well, who is going to actually pay for that with their own time? What's the distribution of time that makes that possible? And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there too about just exploitation, expropriation. Lots more to say
Hmm.
about Marx and time too, but anyway, that's a whole nother podcast episode. But I think it's good to just kind of reiterate that point constantly, that we often imagine the economy works in this like perfectly empty void, like a vacuum where things just kind of go the way that you want. But the economy is always tied to all these physical relationships and an incredibly complicated network of stuff. So when you tinker with it in one place, it's inevitably going to do something somewhere else. And that's really important to sort out if you're interested in something like social justice or global equality.
Yeah, man, the Virilioian like applications of this have like no end. Uh Man, there's a big idea in Paul Virilio, especially about like urban design, is that he's always really interested in how cities pass traffic through them. And
Hmm.
there every major city is connected to every other major city through an airport or whatever. It signals that the city is like a modern city that's interconnected and so on. But if you think about it, like those, like whatever, an airport in St. Louis, Missouri exists, and it flies. There are flights to and from Chicago like 1,000 times a day. And there's also a train line as well, but it's like slow and it's considerably more time consuming for the individual person, like the individual rider or whatever. But like, think about how much time is wasted on like flights that go to and from, if rather than like, a large sweeping investing in like a new high speed rail or something that would save everyone even way more time or whatever. It's just like it becomes so absurd the more that you think about it. But I think that this framing is really helpful. That because the locus of speed is so often like convenience, and that is kind of a confusing element of it all as well. So, anyways, very cool. A very helpful way to start laying things out when you think about how much time you're taking to go from point A to point B, or you're going to
Yeah.
fly, you're going to take the train, or whatever. I think it's great. Think about how many like little guys out there have to run around and like load your baggage and like make sure that your plane can take off, and then like 13 other planes can take off, and if somebody has a private jet, they're gonna jam up the whole they're gonna jam up the whole situation and like whatever. It's just it's something that we don't often consider because the convenience of it all is sort of like framed as basically magic that gets you from point A to point B, but it's not magic at all.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's, I think, a lot to be said about kind of developing a whole Christian ethic around time in general and a kind of liberating theology of time. This is a secret idea I've had for a very long time that I'll probably never do anything with, so I might as well say it here. But, like, I just think a lot about how in the Bible's relationship to time is always very complex. Like the Jubilee year, for example, is such an interruption in time. People often talk about how Christianity and the Jewish Bible introduce like a notion of linear time into history. This is like a really popular way of understanding what's going on in the Bible in general. And I think that there is like something to that. And they'll often say that this linear time both enables a kind of progressive direction where you can like make the world better or whatever. The world doesn't have to be the way that it is. It could be improved, or you could like move toward an eschatological future that is not here. But it also enables like the destruction of cyclical time, which is how a lot of indigenous people in particular are organized. And that is a colonial project where you kind of erase cyclical time in favor of linear time. Anyway, this is all a long aside to say it's complicated. But I think that there's actually a lot of affirmation of kind of other times and other kinds of times in the Bible. So the Jubilee year being one where every 50 years you kind of reset all these economic relationships. The debts are canceled, slaves go free, land gets returned, and you sort of go back in time in a weird way. Or maybe like a better way of putting it is you kind of like spiral forward in time. So it's not cyclical per se, but it's also not perfectly linear. Or you think about when Jesus is wandering around and he's like, the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, like don't worry about what happens tomorrow. There's this kind of different relationship to time in general throughout the biblical story that isn't so simply like leaning into linear progressive time. And I often think, man, what a like kind of huge competitor to capitalist time that the Bible offers, right? Like the idea that you shouldn't really worry about tomorrow is like a completely anti-capitalist sentiment, but it's the kind of thing that Jesus is encouraging his followers to think about and sort out. So anyway, all that to say, the distribution of time, I think there's like a kind of liberating theology there somewhere that still needs to be articulated, and especially as capitalism is more and more accelerated, kind of having some Christian language that's like, we got to pull the brakes on this stuff in the way that Verlio is
Mm.
trying to do is maybe something that needs to be developed a little further.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. I mean, I think that there's a way that, a lot of liturgical ritual plays into that same kind of thing too, right?
Hmm.
Where like, I mean, every Sunday you're kind of in a weird, a weird time bubble where things are, I don't know, depending on how much you like church or don't like church, things are going very fast or very slow or somewhere in between or whatever. Or even like the big holidays out of the year, like Christmas is kind of like that too, where it's like a weird time that is cyclical in a way that you're kind of always revisiting the past and the future. Yeah, man, these are cool ideas. Shoot, I'm realizing we don't have very much time left. Whoa. Okay. Let's get to some of the teeth of this chapter and this argument too. Okay, so an economy requires both productive time and reproductive time. And this is a thing that Parikh says that I think this is kind of gets us in an interesting direction. He says, far more than we might think, the economy is a zero-sum game. Growth in the tip of the economic iceberg, part measured by the GDP, can only happen at the cost of a decline of potential growth in the submerged part. This is true for natural resources and time, as well for goods and services. An apartment on Airbnb is an apartment that isn't on couch surfing. A barrel of oil burned to heat a trading floor is a barrel of oil that won't be burned to heat a party venue. And an article written for a paid subscription newspaper is one less article in a free encyclopedia. GDP growth is therefore an opportunity cost in terms of non economic development. So this is very interesting because we all live in a finite planet with finite time. We all only have 24 hours in one day. The more time that is like funneled into the part of the iceberg that's above the water, the GDP part of the iceberg, the productive part, means that there's less time for all the other stuff going on in the world. And that is, I think, actually really scary. The more that you think about it, the more every part of your life becomes commodified. Not even just through like whatever you're working longer hours or something is maybe one way to think about that. But even the way he says it here, like not only is your labor time commodified or something, but maybe the apartment that you live in is commodified because like every weekend you rent it out on Airbnb or something. So there's more that contributes more to the GDP. But then, if your friends want to come stay, they don't have a place to stay, and it's a whole thing, right? So more GDP, less reproductive time, all very scary. And then I don't know, to me, even too, like to take it a step further, the ways that even like our reproductive time is caught up in productive time, like the more that you're using social media or something, for example, the more that you're exposed to advertising in the world contributing to the GDP. So it's like more and more time of your waking life is funneled into production and away from reproduction, or confusing and blurring the lines between the two things, which is bad.
Hmm.
Very scary. So I don't want to stop there for too long because I'm too afraid of the whole thing. But Timothy Parrique has a bit more where he says that kind of commodification leads to all kinds of situations where like the social bonds that people share with one another sort of start dissolving a bit. Commodification is a way to sort of corrupt social activity. So one example that he gives, I'm not going to read it from the book here, but one example that he gives is that like parents parents of kids in a neighborhood, they might set up some type of like rotating childcare where one parent's watching all the kids play at the park, or watching someone's kid while parents go do something else. Parent things. But that whole system starts breaking down when the commodification of childcare enters into the situation, where like well, if like one family completely backs out of that whole scheme because they've hired someone to do childcare, then that is like one less bit, in the social reproductive part that it sort of corrodes. And then, if one family goes down, then maybe more will go along with it, and that kind of thing. Uh, Not to say that like, I don't know, people shouldn't get paid or whatever for watching your kids. It's a job for sure, but there's a difference between like paying someone's local teens to watch the kids and like hiring somebody from like an agency or something like that, because it matters, like I think on a few different levels. I mean, one is the obvious sort of productive level about GDP and like how it's growing and so on, but also like the social ties of all that stuff is I think a pretty big deal, especially when it comes to like children and childcare and communities of kids or whatever. If you don't know, it's a net negative to not know the parents and kids that your own child is also friends with. I think that is bad. It sort of degrades the ways that communities are interconnected and knit together a type of cohesiveness. So all of that I think is really worth saying and thinking about in terms of social reproduction and the ways that, yeah, like, those connections tie communities together, and that's the case too with churches as well. But Dean, I feel like you have a bigger take on that I'll give you the space to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, childcare is such a good example to start illustrating this stuff, right? Because it's a thing that people need. And there's a lot of ways of organizing it. And historically, socialist countries, like in the Soviet Union, Cuba, and elsewhere, have responded to that in a number of different creative ways, but with the understanding that childcare should be publicly available. Like, you shouldn't have to rely on, I mean, you shouldn't have to rely on the teens in your neighborhood. You could, but you shouldn't have to rely on them. You shouldn't have to
Sure,
rely on
right.
like your, I don't know, grandparents stepping in and like giving some of their time freely and volunteering it or whatever. There should be an affordable, state subsidized, guaranteed program that allows people to, kind of solve that problem in their basic life. And I think something you hear a lot in conservative Christian circles is that the state shouldn't provide all kinds of services, whether it's childcare or feeding hungry people, or working with the homeless, or I don't know, whatever, whatever government program they don't like. The state shouldn't do it. Instead, they say like the church or local communities; those are really the people who should be kind of shouldering those burdens in their society. And I think that there are problems with kind of offloading responsibility to the state, and the state can kind of evacuate local communities of their own autonomy and activity and so on. But the irony of that sort of sentiment coming from conservative Christians is that there's like nothing preventing people from doing that right now, and they aren't. So, the state is like doing something because it understands that that's a need. And I think that's the interesting thing when we start talking about things like degrowth and getting rid of commodification and so on. What would a community actually need in order to enable the decommodification of things like childcare or, I don't know, whatever else, housing and so on? It would need non market solutions. It would need publicly guaranteed and reliable solutions. The church, I think, often, even progressive churches, kind of understand themselves as providing a safety net for the people who fall through the cracks of capitalism. And to be clear, I think that is very good. I think churches should do that. I'm glad that they do. But some people use that to kind of stop their thinking and be like, and that's good. Like, society will inevitably have cracks, and the church should just be there. Whereas the church ought to, or Christians ought to, because they care about everybody, and want everybody to have kind of equal access to those things, advocate then for public kinds of programs that ensure that people can do that. And I wonder, like, if that were the case, then what would the identity of churches really be? That's something that you see in Christians who are reflecting on revolutionary situations, like Sergio Arce, who we've talked about in the past.
Mhm.
He was a Cuban Presbyterian who welcomed the revolution as an opportunity to figure out, well, what would the church be if it couldn't complain about capitalism, or it couldn't deal with like the, kind of social problems that emerge from capitalism? What would that mean for the gospel? What would it mean for Christian identity? And again, it's kind of that time economy. Like, what kind of time would the church now have to figure out how to, I don't know, make people into better Christians or better people or whatever? And
Mhm.
all that to say, I think there's like a lot of interesting stuff to consider where it's like, what's the role of the church in building a degrowth future? I think it's kind of like getting away from the idea that the church is fundamentally like a really good social program, or could be a good social program, whether you're a conservative or a progressive, and instead to be like, how does the church kind of tap into these alternative logics around time and exploitation and so on, such that it can demand a better social reality and kind of contribute to that effort. So I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think churches should quit like feeding people or running childcare centers or whatever. But I do think churches should not see that as like an end goal. They should see that as like a compromise in a bad system, and try to work themselves out of a job, I guess, in some respect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's actually pretty compelling. Whatever in the revolution, again on that utopian horizon, churches can work themselves out of jobs. They can fill the ever shrinking gaps. That's awesome. I mean, in the meantime, we have so much stuff to do. Um, something I saw this kind of recently. There's a church in Scotland that started doing this thing where it basically used its space. In Scotland, Christianity is not very popular. I mean, it's a ostensibly Christian country and has all kinds of like Christian infrastructure and all kinds of things like that. Well, a lot of history in that, but like by and large, most people don't go to church. What I've seen in a few cases though is our churches really just like kind of like, I don't want to say like letting go of like the Christian part, because I don't think that's probably true, but really embracing the idea that they are at least a space that is sort of central in people's communities. Whether or not people actually attend church is a whole nother question, but like, the building is central and it sort of it plays sort of historic roles in communities. And because of that, people will set up all types of um, really interesting types of like social situations, I think, in communities. Like, for example, a pretty common thing is to have like churches will just like kind of make lunch for people and like create a space for people to come and hang out and talk, especially if they are people who are older or, I don't know, lonely or whatever the case might be. Or like there's this other church too that it basically made a, I don't know, a part of the church building like into a maker space for the community, which is pretty cool too. I mean, these are different answers to different types of problems than feeding people and clothing people and providing childcare.
Hmm.
But I guess the important thing to me in these examples is that they are creating like they're using that like particular position of a church in a community to create a way to sort of deepen social connection, and I think that is pretty cool.
Hmm.
Something to that is towards reproduction and not just production in an interesting way.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think about a situation like Cuba where right now in the economic crisis, churches do provide some of those like um gap filling measures. Like churches receive a lot of aid, international aid, which they use in all kinds of important and essential ways to expand the healthcare capacity in Cuba, for example, to provide clean drinking water for people, all that kind of stuff. And I think that is awesome, but
Yeah.
ideally they wouldn't have to do that, right? and
Mm.
and that's what a lot of churches there feel. In my own experience talking to them, is like it is too bad that they have to do that. At the same time, when churches consider their relationship to the revolution, like we've talked about with Jim Hodgson a bunch of times on the show in the past, Christians in Cuba see themselves as kind of deepening the revolution. So for example, on LGBTQ rights, when they were trying to pass the family code, it was churches who were really organizing all these like community conversations to help average Cuban citizens kind of find their way in discussions around sexual diversity and all these kinds of issues at stake in a possible change to the Cuban constitution. And I think that's like, the when the church is contributing in a good way to the reproduction of society, it's also expanding society's capacity to be like welcoming, affirming, just, etc., and always trying to attend to who's marginalized or left out, even in a revolutionary process. And it's like, man, maybe if churches didn't think of themselves as primarily like, I don't know, kind of like liberal social service providers at best, you know, maybe then there'd be a more kind of ambitious role for the church. But nevertheless, even without that ambition, the church kind of naturally ends up in these situations like the ones you're describing, Matt, where it's just like, I don't know, people do have real needs and churches can provide for those needs. And I guess the goal is to say, hopefully not in such a way that they just end up reproducing capitalism or like,
Yeah.
filling in the burdens of capitalism, but instead trying to help people come up with the capacity and identities that allow them to, ask for something more or demand something more than capitalism's able to give.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Man, Interesting. Sorry, I've there's like 30 more things we could probably say about that, but it's probably we should probably wrap up the episode. Um, Maybe one second before we do wrap it up. It's a cool book. We've said throughout the episode. The part that I liked the most, or maybe I was most interested in, this chapter, of course, but also towards the end, Parrique also has a chapter about like a post-growth society and kind of working out some ideas about like what that looks like. And I really appreciate that part. And his conclusion is about, leaving capitalism behind. Very interesting. Parrique is like a person who is, I think, pretty expansive he's not like a political ideologue. He's not married to like one particular idea or another, in terms of like political philosophy, but he cites people like Murray Bookchin and stuff like that. So like, sort of more like libertarian socialism, left com kind of stuff. And I don't know, it's all really interesting to me. I like that he's like kind of thinking about that in a deeper way. This is I think like a thesis or an idea that is sort of yet to I've not seen anybody really kind of tackle this in a book, and like we didn't either, because our book is sort of a different scope as well. But like there's a type of political philosophy that is going on in degrowth where a lot of people are kind of taking a sort of like left socialist, or sorry, like libertarian socialist approach to it. But man, I would love to see somebody like work out more about the role of the state in sort of degrowth, because all this stuff is really cool. Trying to find ways to do like a really participatory and democratic socialism is something I'm really invested in. But I would love to read something by someone who's thought about it a lot or done like a kind of bigger study on the whole thing, just about the ways that the state has to kind of either be involved in it, or how people might think the state should not be involved. I mean, I have a particular position on this, but anyways, the end of this book really got me thinking about it, where Murray Bookchin or whoever is maybe not my exact cup of tea or something, but I'm just really interested in the bigger question, I think, that's going on behind this, that you can commons things all you want, and you can degrow and stuff, but like, how are you going to make the capitalist class go along with it or whatever? That's my question that I'm kind of leaving the book with after I've finished it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. There's not it's not a degrowth theory of the state in this book for sure. He does talk though about like the importance of nationalizing fossil fuel companies, and then
That's right. Yeah.
Winding them down, and dealing with the inevitable problems that come with that. And so there is like a lot going on there, but it's true. It's not a statecraft book. There's one article that is called Degrowth in the State that was co-authored by Georgios Kallis in, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I guess. And I remember reading it a long time ago, and it was interesting because they kind of recognized that there's a lack of theory of the state in degrowth. And I think there's some interesting stuff in it. But it's also not really like a theory of maybe what you might call like a revolutionary state, or how to like get a movement that builds toward that. And you get a little bit more of that in John Bellamy Foster's stuff. He's looking through like the history of socialist states in particular to think about planning. But I was interested, I think we posted this in the Discord, but Jason Hickel, there was a recent interview with him on the anniversary of, Less is More being published. And it's a good interview. There's a very funny moment where he like is basically, he doesn't exactly say this, but he does say this exactly, if that makes sense, that there should be like a vanguard party, like there needs to be a revolutionary party that's capable of kind of knitting together the many disconnected struggles for justice. And that's what degrowth needs, is like a, basically not like the degrowth party, but degrowth ought to feature in a kind of vanguardist socialist movement. So anyway, maybe there's like a shift in degrowth literature, or maybe Jason Hickel is just like one guy talking about stuff and nobody else will catch on. But it's true, there's like some really important missing building blocks on how you actually get from A to B, and what B would really look like in the end. And yeah, I mean, like you said, we didn't do it in our book either, but maybe we gesture toward it in some interesting ways that liberation theology kind of allows you to explore.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Jason Hickel, the vanguard of the vanguard. Love it. Well, something we can think about more in the future, and I'm sure someone else out there is also thinking about. So maybe we can do some more research. But yeah, an interesting question. Any other big takeaways for you, Dean, on this book?
It's a good book. I think, okay, here's something we could have said at the beginning, but I'll just say it at the end by way of closing. There are a ton of books that are trying to introduce the idea of degrowth, and they're all good. They're all fine. I've read probably 10 of them at this point, and, they all kind of have their specific, like, emphasis or whatever, their rhetorical point, and so on. I had to pick one of them to teach in this class, and I chose The Future's Degrowth, for better and worse. They're all good, like I said, but I think this book is actually probably one of the best introductions to degrowth, insofar as like it's rhetorically very fun to read. Like he allows himself to have a good time, and that's really helpful. And also, it's like meaty enough to be like you would get an idea of some of the fundamental points and debates and so on that you could kind of pursue. And there's a really good chapter on like critics of degrowth that could help you like maybe orient yourself around some of those criticisms. So maybe that's the last thing I'd say is I think of all the big books on the market, it's one of the better kind of intro books. That also is not just like a basic introduction, but kind of helps you find your way in the conversation. I wish that we would have had it like 2 or 3 years ago when we started thinking about our own book. That would have been very helpful.
Yeah, big time. Well, you can read this book too. Timothée Parrique, Slow Down or Die. There you go. Go find it on the internet. Buy it from the publisher directly, or a small independent bookstore. That's a great idea. Cool. Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you support us at $1 or more, you get an invite to our cool behind the paywall only Discord server where we talk about degrowth, where we talk about what happened at church today, where we share memes, we talk about Jeremy Fragrance, always a recurring topic. Such a funny guy. Cool. Anyways, you should get in there. It's great. A great group of people all kind of doing their thing. Very nice. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon, and we'll see you next time.
Get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.